Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Good evening. I'm Steve Willis, co-founder of Hope Sheds Light. Along with my partners Arvo Prima and Ron Rossetto, we welcome you to our family support meeting. It's really exciting to see all the new faces we have here and our old friends. Thank you all, and we thank our friends at Facebook for joining us. This is a special night. For those of you who are just learning about Hope, Hope is a nonprofit. We are dedicated to educating and raising awareness about the impact of addiction for individuals and families in the whole community. We do it by sharing our personal experiences, having the courage to do that. We share our wisdom and our strength and our resources that will lead to the long-term recovery of the entire family. That's the purpose of Hope. We want to remove the fear and stigma that's associated with this disease by providing a loving and safe, hopeful environment. That's what these family support meetings are. Okay? We want families to be able to heal and the whole community to become better. So this is our family support meeting. It meets on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. I am determined that we will do it more often. We will, okay? But it's in the beautiful Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Toms River. The purpose of this, we want you to know that you're not alone, right? That an effective, supportive system exists for you. Our hope is that by us sharing with you and you with us, you'll change the way you think and feel about addiction, and in turn become healthier. So what we do here, we start off this night with a brilliant colleague that comes to join us. It's an educational part. It's about 45, 50 minutes or so. The purpose of it is to talk about addiction and treatment recovery, some aspect of it to help us all get better. And then we're going to break out into groups. And we get to share what's in our hearts, what's on our minds, and we share what we've heard and the impact that this disease and substance misuse has on us. Our hope and prayer is that you walk out of here with hope, know that you're loved, and yet that you'll come back. This is a fun time, okay? So with that, let me introduce our speaker for tonight. This is Mariel. She's the Executive Director of the Ammon Foundation, and we're blessed that she's here. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Mariel Hufnagel. I'm the Executive Director of the Ammon Foundation. I'm also a person in long-term recovery, which means I've been alcohol and drug-free for over 11 years. I guess first, I quickly want to thank you, Steve, for the eloquent way that you just spoke about the way that addiction impacts the family, and also the person-centered language that you used. And Steve talked about breaking stigma, and the language that we use is so important, right? So when we're talking about someone who has a substance use disorder, or when we're talking about somebody in recovery, or when we're talking about when someone has an overdose or a fatal overdose, right? The way we refer to these people, the way that we refer to these situations is so important, because so often we don't use person-centered language, and we talk from a place of pain or fear or anger. And my experience as someone who has suffered from addiction, someone who is in recovery, and someone who has worked with families and people who have a substance use disorder, is that there is so much shame, guilt, and fear already associated with this disease that when our language includes those things, it just perpetuates the problem. And so I'm not here to talk about messaging. I was just really touched with the way Steve talked about addiction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what we call at the Ammon Foundation the 4 pillars of recovery. The way I'm going to do that is, and I don't know who the rest of your speakers have been or how they have presented to you guys, but the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to share with you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about my recovery. And I'm going to talk about how these 4 pillars haven't been present in my recovery and have been present in my recovery. And then I'm going to incorporate some statistics and some data and some research about them as well. So it's going to be kind of infusion of my personal story, my personal experience, and then what research and data shows about people maintaining long-term recovery. And I really don't want to talk at you guys. Please feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, and I will be certain to leave some time at the end for questions as well. So I hope that works with everybody. So by now you're probably wondering what the hell are the 4 pillars of recovery, right? So, but first, before I tell you, I'd like to ask you guys, what do you guys think are the most important facets of supporting somebody so they can maintain their recovery? Love, beautiful.
Consistency.
Okay, consistency. Communication.
Support.
Support, what kind of support?
Accountability.
Accountability, okay. Motivation, understanding, okay. So what about boundaries? What about slightly more concrete things? Shelter, bingo. Education, bingo. Encouragement. Bingo, but not a 4-pillar, but bingo. Employment, bingo. And the last one, network, food, medical, healthcare. Okay? So, and everything that we could have, like the 38 pillars of recovery, right? Everything that each of you just said is super important. However, specific to what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about what needs to be in place in order for someone to be able to thrive in their recovery, and as a result of someone being able to build a life that's worth living, a life that's full of meaning and purpose and connection, the likelihood of them re-engaging in use significantly diminishes. I also want to just say in the beginning as a caveat that there is no cookie cutter answer, and there's also no golden elixir. So, right? So let's be perfectly clear that someone could have every support service in place, someone could have all of the things that you just mentioned, and could still succumb to the disease of addiction, right? And so this is, I wish I had some magic, fail-safe, fail-proof, way to tell you if you support an individual with these things, they absolutely will stay sober. Unfortunately, I don't have that. Hopefully, eventually, one day, medicine will develop something that allows for that. But I also just want to be very clear that all of the pieces could be perfectly in alignment, and someone could still be so far along in their disease that they could succumb. And so I want to be super clear about that before we start. So to give you kind of just a little snapshot of me, right? So I already told you guys, I've been in recovery over 11 years. That means I was able to enter into and maintain my recovery since I was 21 years old. And I think that's important, right? Because I think a lot of the messaging that surrounds addiction and surrounds recovery leaves it to be construed that perhaps someone between the ages of 14 and 25 is just going through a phase, right? And that intervention isn't necessarily appropriate, right? Because it's just a phase, they're young. And I have really very limited amount of regrets in my life, and I believe that everything happened exactly as it was supposed to be to allow me to become who I am and do what I do. However, one of the things that I often think about, if something could have been different, right? So I got sober when I was 21, and I found out that people got sober when I was 20 and a half, right? So had I known earlier that recovery was real, that recovery was possible, that treatment was available, that support was accessible, perhaps I could have gotten sober at 17 or 18 or 19, right? And so much of why I do what I do is about making the message of recovery really clear, right? And kind of breaking some of those misnomers that we walk around knowingly or unknowingly about what addiction and what recovery looks like, right? Oftentimes when I share my story, and I'm not going to do that completely with you guys, But oftentimes when I share my story, I also talk about my story is really rather unextraordinary, right? I come from a home full of love. I come from all of my needs and most of my wants being provided. I come from every opportunity being at my disposal. I come from the best schools, the best neighborhoods, upper middle class family, what people would wish for as a childhood. And yet, I still developed a substance use disorder, right? And so I also think circumstantially, we often look at and kind of pigeonhole what addiction looks like and who will suffer from it, right? And I know that I even did that myself, right? So when I started to experiment with drugs and when my substance misuse began to take off, I had a very clear picture of what someone who was an addict looked like. And it wasn't me, right? And so even as my substance misuse got more and more out of control, I still had this justification and this rationalization about that I didn't fit this cookie cutter picture of what someone who suffered from addiction looked like. And that was one more barrier that stood in the way of me ever getting well, because I didn't think that I could potentially ever suffer from addiction. Right? And so I think that that's important to share with you guys as well, right? Because along with this misnomer that it's a phase, or that, people don't get well until they get older, or that there are things that can be done to intervene, none of that is necessarily always true, right? And so with that misnomer often comes a lot of shame and a lot of guilt, not just for the person who is suffering from addiction, but also for the family, right? What could I have done better? What did I do wrong? How could I have helped in a different way? And oftentimes the answer is that you couldn't have, right? So the last thing that I talk about when I share my full story is I also talk about the rapidness of my progression, right? And that's not necessarily true for everybody. Some people have a very, very long progression that takes place over years, if not decades. That's not my experience, and I just think that that's also important to share. Initially when I started experimenting with alcohol and drugs, I was very, very young, probably 9, 10, or 11, but I didn't start using daily until I was about 17. And I just want to share with you what happened when I was 17. Is I started using daily, and within a matter of weeks, my whole life changed dramatically, right? So it didn't take me 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right, to get to the darkest point of my life. It took me only a matter of a couple of weeks. And I think that that's important to share because, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to talk about the brain extensively, but I do think it's important to say that even when I was experimenting with drugs, right, I never for a minute envisioned or pictured what my life would become as a result of it. I never for a minute thought that I would become mentally and physically addicted to substances. I never for a minute thought that it would bring me to where it brought me. I thought I was just experimenting with alcohol and drugs, right? And what happened is something changed in my brain, right? Something changed in my brain that was out of my control, that brought me to a point of desperation, right? And brought me to a point where getting alcohol and drugs and using alcohol and drugs became about survival. Not about fun, not about pleasure, not about partying. It became about survival. And so there's a movie or a PSA, like a 3-minute YouTube that I like when I talk to kids about it. And it talks about that humans have 5 survival mechanisms, right? That the brain tells them to, the frontal cortex through the limbic system, that 5 things are vital. And that is procreation, food, shelter, and 2 other things. Procreation, food, shelter, protecting your young, and water, right? And so the reason why I think this is important, and maybe it may seem like I'm slightly gearing off track, is when we talk about breaking stigma, right, it's so important to understand what happened in that 3 weeks, right? And so what happened, and I like to think of, what if you were in a situation where one of those survival things that you needed for survival was taken away from you, right? And so I'm going to assume that you're a morally sound and ethical human being, right? And things like stealing or lying or hurting somebody are not necessarily in your character, and something that you would hold yourself to a higher standard than doing. However, think about if you hadn't had a drink of water in 10 days, right? And the only way that you could get water would be to steal it. Think about if you hadn't had a drink of water in 30 days, and the only way that you could get water would be to hurt somebody, to drink. I don't know what you would do, but I can pretty clearly bet you that if I hadn't had a drink of water in 30 days, and the only way that I could drink would be by hurting somebody, I think I would do it. And so I use that juxtaposition to try to allow you to stand in the shoes of someone whose brain is telling them that if they don't get alcohol and drugs, they're going to die. That it becomes about survival, right? And I think by humanizing those who suffer from addiction, and by allowing people to begin to understand what's going on in the brain of somebody who's suffering, it becomes easier to be empathetic, sympathetic, and compassionate, right? When the symptoms of addiction don't foster those emotions, right? Because the symptoms of addiction look like stealing, lying, cheating, saying hateful things, hurting people, and symptomatically, those look very different than any other lifestyle disease, right? So asthma, cancer, diabetes, chronic heart disease. However, and this is way off in a tangent, I would challenge you, and my mother is a breast cancer survivor, I would challenge you that the reason why symptomatically addiction looks different than other lifestyle disease is because the system treats addiction differently than other lifestyle diseases. If my mother wasn't able to get chemo, I would have killed somebody to get it for her, right? I would have done incorrigible things to save my mother's life because it was about survival. But that was unnecessary because the system took care of her health condition. And that's not how we deal with addiction. So speaking about the system, I think, brings us right into kind of what the 4 pillars of recovery are, right? And so what it looks like before I get sober, right, is so I'm 20 years old, I get sober a week after I turned 21. I'm homeless, living on the streets of Norwalk, Connecticut. My addiction took me to prostitution, it took me to incarceration, it took me to homelessness, and it took me, more importantly, to a place of darkness and desolation and isolation and desperation, right? And so often we ask that question, and I can imagine as a family member, this is like the question that is almost so important because you want to be able to engage this moment, right? What is the epiphany you had, right? Like, what was the breaking thing that allowed you to begin to engage in a recovery process? And again, I'll say that my story is not terribly extraordinary, right? That I don't have this, life-changing event or this moment that, a light switch went on and I made a decision to clean up my act, right? What happened is that I was arrested on May 7th, 2007, and I've been able to be in recovery since then. And I think that that's also important to share because so often families are told that somebody has to be willing, that somebody has to be invested and engaged in their recovery process. And I would be remiss to say if that has to be true at some point, right? That if someone never becomes willing to engage in a recovery process, then most likely they are not going to be successful, right? However, I absolutely fundamentally do not believe, because it's the truth for me, that recovery needs to be initiated willingly, right? I was absolutely unwilling to go to Volusia County Correctional Facility. They had different plans for me, right? And what happened there is I was separated long enough from alcohol and drugs that my brain was being able to get a little bit clear. And by that occurring, I began to get a little bit of clarity about what was going on in my life, what was not going on in my life, and that the likelihood of me staying alive or having any purpose, worth, or meaning was dwindling every single day. And that, and it was there in jail that I became willing to engage in a recovery process. So I also often talk about my recovery being based on grace and luck, right? And so talking about luck is what's going to bring us right into the 4 pillars of recovery, right? And so have any of you ever heard, besides Pam, the term recovery ecosystem? Okay, so that's really what I'm going to talk about, right? And so, for the most part, what we hear about when we hear about recovery is we hear about abstinent-based recovery, we hear about someone needing to be willing, we hear about anonymous 12-step fellowships, we hear about, stop enabling your loved one, right? We hear about, there's some generic things that we hear about when we talk about addiction and when we talk about recovery. And I'm not for or against necessarily any of those things I just listed. What we don't talk about, right, and I've already referred to addiction as a chronic relapsing condition. I've already referred to addiction as what I like to call a lifestyle disease, right? What we don't talk about is a continuum of care, right? And so with any other chronic relapsing condition, there's a full continuum of care, right? So there's primary prevention, right? So let's look back at diabetes, right? Think about Michelle Obama's campaign about child obesity and Be Healthy Now, or whatever it was, where we're dealing with informing youth at a young age, not necessarily not to eat bad food, right? But like how to have a healthy lifestyle, instilling a culture of wellness, right? And then let's say there's an intervention. If your 11-year-old is morbidly obese, a pediatrician steps in and we try to take some action, right? And then let's say this child develops diabetes. There's treatment, right? It's not waited until somebody is stage 4, about to die, needs a limb to be amputated as a result of their diabetes, to start medically treating the condition, right? And then once someone begins to change their life, right, there's all sorts of support services for this person, right? Oh, hey, you're gonna get a free gym membership. Oh, hey, you're gonna be connected to this community center. Oh, hey, you're gonna do all of these things to support living a healthy lifestyle. Because diabetes is chronic, relapsing, and progressive, it's also preventable, right? And so needing to change your lifestyle is involved in treating your diabetes. So if addiction is a chronic, relapsable, and preventable condition, right? Then it needs to be treated in the same way. And so that means there needs to be primary prevention, there needs to be early intervention, there needs to be screening, there needs to be treatment, not when it's terminal, right? There needs to be treatment ahead of the ball, because we've done screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And then where I come in and where I put my stake in the ground, there has to be recovery support services, right? So when someone goes to treatment, we're lucky if it's 3 days in detox now, if that many, right? But someone is able to go to treatment 28 days, 90 days, maybe a year, right? Then what? Right? And I often talk about that I don't think we necessarily have an addiction problem. I think we have a relapsing problem, right? The problem is absolutely, do we not have enough beds? Yes, absolutely. Are there cracks in our system in all areas? Yes. But the thing that is most lacking is, what does someone do and how are they supported after they've gone to treatment? And so this is where the 4 pillars come in, right? And so the 4 pillars, which you guys all got right on the head, is continued education, it's safe housing, it's stable employment, and it's adequate health care. Okay, and so I'm gonna just walk through each of those and share a little bit about my personal experience in recovery without those, as well as with those. So I got sober in Florida, and I already told you I was homeless, so I didn't have a lot going on, which also meant I didn't have money, I didn't have a lot of family support, I didn't have insurance. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a place to live. I didn't have any of the 4 pillars, right? But so I was able to get into a halfway house through having the family support to give me a loan to pay the deposit for 1 week until I was able to get a job and pay my own way, right? And so this is where that idea of luck comes in, right? Like, I had the perfect storm, as you'll see, as I talk, as I go through each 4 of these, I had the perfect storm of circumstances, right? And that is a really unfortunate, terrible, borderline criminal way for us to depend on people being able to recover, right? That they have to have the perfect storm of system, of access and insurance and family support to be able to get well, right? There is no equity there. There is, and I think oftentimes about people that I used to run with or people that I used to know that had just as much, passion and heart and intelligence and love, if not more than me, right? But they didn't have the same access to services, they didn't have the same access to care, they didn't have the same family support, they didn't have any of these things, and as a result, many of them are dead or continuing to do what we were doing together 12 years ago, right? And so most importantly, I was able to get into a safe place to live, right? Because think about if you didn't have a safe place to live, right? That is incredibly stressful, right? Not only not having somewhere to live, right? But having somewhere safe. Having somewhere where you can go and know that your stuff is safe, know that your body is safe, and you can get a good night's sleep, right? Think about trying to be able to function in the world without a safe place to sleep at night. It's very, very difficult, right? And so I was able to get into a halfway house when I first got sober, right? About a year after that, I tried to rent my own apartment with a roommate, right? However, as a convicted felon, that was very, very difficult, right? So what we're needing to do is, and my call to action for you guys is not necessarily that we need to be providing people in recovery with these 4 things. I do think there is a role for certain agencies to be able to do that, but more, my call to action is that we need to identify what are the barriers and how can we be a connector or a resource broker or an assister in allowing somebody in early recovery to be able to be connected to these 4 things, right? So an example of that was my mom gave me a loan for the first week of rent, right? Which allowed me to get in the door, right? Which allowed me to have a safe place to put my head on the pillow, which allowed me to, in turn, have a little less anxiety, a little less stress, a little less fear, and allowed me to then be more focused on looking for a job, right? So when I was a year sober though, and I was trying to get not a waitressing job, not a bartending job, not a job at McDonald's, right? And live somewhere that wasn't a halfway house, right? I began to run into these barriers as a convicted felon, right? And for many, not everybody, but for many people who suffer from addiction, oftentimes there are interactions with the law, right? And so looking at how is a felony record a barrier for education, employment, housing, right? It can be a tremendous barrier. So how do we talk about the expungement process? How do we educate people? How do we advocate for drug courts? How do we advocate for the medicalization of addiction instead of the criminalization of addiction, right? Rehabilitation, treatment instead of incarceration. How do we look to help treat somebody so when they go into the world wanting to be a sober, productive member of society, that they're not beat down over and over and over again, reinstilling that old idea, the tape of like, I'm not worthy, I'm never gonna amount to anything, I can't do it, I should just give up, right? And for many people in early recovery, that is the narrative, right? I have never been successful at anything, my life has no worth and meaning, and so then I'm getting turned away from house after house. I'm getting turned away from job after job. It's very diminishing. It's very hopeless, right? And without being crass, although I'm known to be crass, if I can't live a life worth living, where I'm so full of pain and anger and fear and anxiety, why would I not get high, right? And I'm not saying for a second that life needs to be perfect for someone to stay sober, because that's absolutely untrue, right? And I'll tell you, I know that on so many levels, right? However, what I also know is that when life gets difficult, if there's purpose and meaning in your life, it becomes easier and more possible to weather those storms, right? And so supporting somebody in recovery has to be connected to how do I help you to build a life worth living? How can I empower you? Not necessarily how can I hand you a job or a degree or, or a house, right? Or a health insurance plan. But how can I empower you to open the doors to these things, right? So then let's talk about healthcare. So I had a $1,500 a day heroin and crack habit, and I also had a very serious eating disorder since I was about 11 years old. And so I tell you that to tell you that my teeth were in really bad shape when I got sober. And my gums were so inflamed that it was likely that most of my teeth were eventually going to fall out. And I hadn't been to a dentist in about 4 years. My gums were puffy, and you could see it when you looked at me. And like either very, very bright red or kind of grayish. It was very clear that I was unhealthy. And that's just one of the most prominent issues, as well as a handful of other health concerns that I walked into recovery with, right? I was unable to afford health insurance for the first 3 years that I was in recovery. And what that did was it perpetuated me walking around embarrassed, shameful, anxious, fearful, and really just genuinely uncomfortable in the skin I was in, right? And luckily for me, that wasn't a catalyst for me to re-engage in use. However, it absolutely could have been, because all of those things are exactly why I started to engage in use in the first place, right? So being able to take care of my personal health, right, is really important for me to be able to feel good about myself. And feeling good about myself, again, not like every second of every day thinking I'm $1 million, but being able to like look in the mirror and not want to die, right? Being able to have a little bit of self-confidence and self-worth, being able to feel like I'm an equal with you. Those are really vital if I'm going to maintain my recovery. And healthcare is one of the vital parts of me being physically healthy, right? And so then continued education. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the Ammon Foundation, but we're great, you should check us out. But the primary thing that we do is we give scholarships away, not for treatment, but for education. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about education and why it's so important, right? And there's very limited research about recovery because it's an emerging field. There's a lot of research, and not even a lot of research comparable to other diseases, but there's a lot of research about genetics and the brain and treatment modalities, and there's very, very limited research about recovery and the recovery process. However, there is some emerging research that talks about the correlation between positive recovery outcomes and education. One statistic so staggering that I think it's important to share with you. So unfortunately, and I think many of us in this room know this statistic all too well, for people who are engaging in a treatment process, within the first 2 years, 9 out of 10 of them are re-engaging in use. And that's a very dismal statistic, right? And that's a national statistic, so it's not necessarily that, obviously there are treatment centers that are better, there are families that have the ability to support people more, there are all sorts of circumstances, but those are the national statistics, and that is terribly dismal, and in my humble opinion, absolutely unacceptable. Looking at that same population, people who are going and engaging in some sort of treatment, and then continuing their education in some capacity, which doesn't just mean college, it could also mean vocational training, it could also mean a certificate program, something that opens the door to employment, right? That statistics, guys, it changes from 9 out of 10 re-engaging in use to 3 out of 10 re-engaging in use. That is crazy. That is crazy. And so why? Right? What does education do besides the obvious, which I just said, which is it opens doors to employment, which is really, really important. Education does a lot more than that. And I'm going to share with you 2 experiences that I've had with education. The first was when I was a couple years sober, and I tried to go back to school, and I'll tell you I was terribly unsuccessful. And I ended up failing out, dropping out, I'm not quite sure. And this is also after 4 attempts in my active use, attempting to go to college. And so the first time I tried to go back to school, I was not supported at all. I was still estranged from my family. I did not yet have health insurance. I did not have gainful employment. I had a very difficult time navigating. I wasn't technically a Florida resident, and I had a very difficult time navigating the financial aid process, and school was very expensive, and I was very broke, so that was a difficult combination. And so I just had all of this stress and anxiety and fear. I also didn't have many life skills, right? And I think it's important when we talk about people building meaningful lives that we ensure that people have the skills to do that. So it's not just the 4 pillars of recovery, that would be 8, the 4 pillars of recovery. It's also fostering someone and coaching someone and mentoring someone or connecting someone to have the soft skills that are necessary to be successful. And so what I mean by that, I mean things like budgeting, time management, study skills, self-care. Some of these things that usually are overlooked clinically, not out of negligence most of the time, more so out of, pervasive emergent clinical needs, right? So if somebody is in treatment and has been incestually raped or abused for 15 years, that trumps, and dealing with that and having closure and healing and processing, that clearly trumps talking about budgeting in treatment, right? However, I would go so far as saying, even if I've worked out that trauma and then I leave treatment and I don't know how to budget, I'm still going to struggle with being successful. And so why I kind of go on perhaps that little tangent about skills is when I went to college the first time when I was sober, I didn't have those skills. They hadn't been taught to me in treatment. They certainly weren't taught to me in jail. And even though I was surrounded and had, a degree of family support and peers that I was connected with, I wasn't being mentored or taught soft skills, right? And there's a level of shame and fear that comes with that because it's just assumed I should know these things, right? And so asking for help about how to budget, right? Asking for help of how to study, how to manage my time, that's embarrassing. So I just didn't, right? And what that looked like is when I went back to school, I was unable to be successful. I would drive to school crying my eyes out, not knowing what to do. My life was unbalanced. I was physically unhealthy because I didn't have health insurance. I wasn't practicing much self-care, right? My checking account was overdrafted, school was expensive, and so I felt like this obligation to have to go. I didn't know how to manage my time, so I didn't know when to study and when to work and when to, practice self-care, and I didn't have time management, and then I also didn't know how to study. So even when I set aside time to study, I didn't really know what I was doing, so it was ineffective, right? And so that's my first experience with school. And when I failed out, dropped out, I don't know exactly which one happened, that once again reinstilled the idea that I'm never going to amount to anything, that I'm not good enough, that I should just give up. And once again, thank God that that wasn't a catalyst for me to re-engage in use, because it could have been, right? So fast forward to when I'm about 5 years in recovery, I go back to school, actually right here in Ocean County at Ocean County College, and I have a very different experience, right? In between years 3 and years 5, I was able to engage in some mentorship and some learning that I was able to begin to build those soft skills. And what that did is it changed my life drastically, right? It allowed me to show up and be a student and know how to manage my time, know how to practice self-care, know how to study when I set aside time to study, know how to, my checking account wasn't overdrafted. There wasn't a lot of money in it, but it wasn't overdrafted. And so all of the fear and anxiety and shame that went along with me when I went to school the first time was significantly diminished when I went to school the second time. And what happened, and Horace Mann talks about education as the great equalizer. And I believe that wholeheartedly. What happened when I went to school as a convicted felon, as a person in recovery, as a formerly homeless, sex trafficking survivor, formerly incarcerated young woman, right? Walking with all of these scarlet letters on me, is I became a student among students, right? I became an equal with people around me, right? And that began to open doors to all of the other 3 pillars of recovery that had been unopenable before, right? So it allowed me to get a gainful employment, not a minimum wage job. It allowed me to, rent a house that was safe and worth living in, right? It allowed me to be able to begin to pay into an insurance premium and have health care, right? So it allowed all of those things because through education, I was able to access employment. And through education and employment, I was able to access healthcare and housing, right? What also happened as a result of going back to school is I learned so much more than just like anatomy and physiology, and I don't know if I even learned any anatomy or physiology, but social, whatever courses I took, absolutely was I able to retain that because now I knew how to study. But more importantly, I was able to build my self-esteem. I was able to foster connection with other people. I was able to also uncover and discover what were some of my passions, what were my skills, what was I good at? And all of that experience was it connected me to feeling worthy, feeling valuable, feeling purpose, feeling meaning. And those are the things that an individual in recovery needs to experience if they're going to maintain their recovery, right? And so I am a tremendous advocate for people in recovery going back to school. I'm also a tremendous advocate for County College. I think it's oftentimes the entry point, right? Most often people are not going to a 4-year university, right after treatment, unless they've taken a medical leave or perhaps they've gotten sober in high school, right? And also, if we're honest, college campuses are somewhat recovery hostile, right? There's a tremendous alcohol and drug culture on college campuses, and in early recovery, if there's not a collegiate recovery program, it might not be the safest environment for someone in early recovery. But a county college is. A county college is. And then I also think it's important to say that not everybody is meant to go to college, right? And a vocational program is just as good as a college, right? And so again, just going back to the numbers, right? That people who pursue education in early recovery, bottom line, are more likely to maintain their recovery. And I think that's for all of the reasons that I just said. Not only does it open doors to employment, which opens doors to housing, which opens doors to healthcare, right? It also fosters worth and value in the person. And then also, just to give you a kind of a little snapshot, because I'm about to wrap up, about what has happened in those 4 areas of my life since I was able to attain some soft skills and go back to school successfully, is my whole life has changed, right? So I have, in the last 5 years, I have been able to live and build this very beautiful life that needs to be the picture of what recovery looks like, right? So I am a wife, I am a homeowner, I'm a taxpayer, I'm an employer, I'm an employee, I'm a master's level graduate, I'm, all of these things that so often don't get associated with someone who suffers from addiction. However, I'll tell you, I still have a chronic progressive treatable brain illness, right? My picture just no longer looks like it was when I was suffering. And not only does it no longer look like what it was when I was suffering, it also no longer looks like what it did in early recovery when I wasn't connected to the 4 pillars of recovery. So I think that's all I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I don't know the format, so I'm awkwardly going to move off camera. I'm going to stay on camera.
Anybody have any questions for Mariel?
Yeah.
Get your questions back.
Just general studies, which I'll tell you, when I was 17, and I don't know why I remember this, I went to a lecture at Columbia University. I grew up in Manhattan, and when I was, it was for seniors who were going to apply for college, and the lady there said, always do general studies unless you are 100% sure what you want to do. Because through the gen eds and general studies, I realized that math and science is not for me, right? But I wouldn't have known that unless I'd been forced to take kind of all of these liberal arts general ed studies. So that would be my suggestion. Yeah.
You have a lot of anxiety, a lot of setback. You did relapse. That's a pretty amazing thing.
Again, I think grace and luck, right? So, without getting too much into my own spiritual beliefs, I believe that the work I do today is a direct result of, what happened earlier, and I believe that I'm called and purposed to do this work. But I also think that a lot of it has to do with luck, which is a terrible way to bank on someone, staying well or getting well. And luck meaning that, thank God my mom was willing to give me this, the loan. Thank God the halfway house had a bed.
You too.
Sure. Thank you.
My son's been in a halfway house, and I paid for this or helped them. Guess what? It didn't work. You must be a very strong person.
Thank you.
That's what I think.
Philosophy, smart recovery, or regular implementing something to maintain long-term sobriety?
Sure, I think it's absolutely important to have something that is a plan for your recovery, right? So, and I think that there is tremendous value in peer-to-peer support, right? Feeling connected to other humans, right? When most of us who are in early recovery or getting well have come from a very isolated, lonely place, right? So I think there's real value in human connection. And I also think there's real value in routine and accountability. And without using the word replace, I'm going to use the word replace. If your lifestyle is surrounding alcohol and drugs, right? You have to replace that. You have to fill the vacuum, right? And invest in something else, whether it's a 12-step fellowship or smart recovery, or, you know, a lot of people get well through the church, you know, but there has to be something there that you can grasp onto, I believe.
So, I just think you hit it right on the head when we're talking, because I'm in recovery and I've been in treatment before, but the difference this time is I had the continual care when I got out, which was able to keep the momentum going. I believe that's what's helped me to remain successful today, without a doubt. My other question was, what was the name of your organization?
The Ammon Foundation. So Ammon, A like salmon, but Ammon, AMMON, and I have cards and, you know, our website and stuff. If we give out scholarships, and we also provide life skills training with some of those things I talked about: budgeting, self-care, time management. So that's what we do. Yeah.
You talked about recovery as an individual. Did your family also find some recovery?
I mean, absolutely. I think when individuals get well, families heal and communities heal. Without getting too far off on a tangent, I think we talk a lot about, you know, enabling and tough love. And my experience with my mother is that she consistently offered me love. She put up boundaries, but she consistently allowed me to have a safe place. I didn't want it most of the time, but she consistently allowed me to have a safe place, and she consistently showed me only love, which, when I felt no love for myself, was the most important thing that I received. And had she not shown me that love, I don't think I would be sober today. And as a result of being able to maintain my recovery, I've been able to begin to show up as the daughter she deserves, and start to mend some of that brokenness that was caused by my behaviors. And it's been a long process. I still, you know, it's 11 and a half years later, and there still will be some times that I don't answer the phone, and she'll call 15 times because this, you know, anxiety will hit her, right? And I have to remember that that's because she was conditioned to, like, me saying, hey, I'm around the corner, Mom, I'll be right there, and then turning my phone off for 4 days, right? So I also think the process is slow, but it definitely happens.
Good? Go ahead.
Well, I got clean far myself. You believe in God?
I do.
Are you a Christian?
I'm not.
So it's a two-part question. Do you find any inner strength through the Bible, and how important is your spirituality in your recovery? Because that's where I'm at in my life right now. I'm saved a year ago.
Beautiful.
I'm like a Jesus.
King Jesus. The spiritual part of my recovery is absolutely vital. I think that not just for someone suffering from addiction, I think humans, you know, holistically are mental, physical, and spiritual beings, and that if we need to treat all three parts of that, not just in addiction, but with any disease or disorder. So without getting on a tangent about the broken nature of our world, right? We absolutely about tapping into inner strength, inner resources, and the universe, Jesus, whatever your religion or spirituality is. It's so important to be connected.
Yes, because I just want to say it. I had 7 years clean before I went out on like a 5-year run, just doing purpose tests, because I had surgery, stuff like that. And this time around, I said it has to be different. And I always wanted to give my life to the Lord, and I did. me is it's like I want to run from them. I don't want to try and convince anybody, but I know what it's doing for me. But yet I still struggle. Like the way I feel today, like when I get let down for some things, it really bothers me. Like today, the judge said to me some things I didn't want to hear, but you know what? He was right. You know, because I had to go to family court with my ex-wife, and it's just what I'm trying to say is like now, even with my spirituality, because I'm a human being, I believe my strongest access is my spirit, mind, and body. And it's like right now, when stuff like this happens to me, I fall short. I think I want to beg out and cry. I don't know what to do sometimes, and it hurts. So,
Well,
And we can talk more about
we
that.
can talk more about that, and that's just also being human, you know? So often I box things of like, oh, I'm suffering because I'm an addict, right? Or like, oh, I'm just a human, and life is hard, and things don't go the way I want, and people are cruel, and I have to experience consequences years later. Like, life is hard, and that's unfortunately just the truth
sometimes
sometimes.
they're cruel, but they're right, and that acceptance is a hard thing for me.
And then you go.
Absolutely.
Okay? Thank you.
Steve.
You did a great job. We really thank Mariel very much for being with us tonight. Now, are we doing evaluations? Bill? Are we? You guys got them? Have you filled them out? If you haven't, fill them out real quick, because now we're going to our groups. Huh? Well, of course I'll mention the walk. Okay, before you go to the groups. September 8th, an important day. That's our 5th celebration of Hope Walk, Seaside Heights, okay, the North End. There's information on our website. You all have to be there and bring everybody you know. It gets bigger and bigger, and it's really a celebration of what we do. It's a celebration of recovery, okay? It's love, and it's hope, and it's joy, and we need all of you to be there. September 8th, okay? Great. So where are these groups going to be? The gold group, oh yeah.